Labor produces all the wealth of the world. The laborer makes civilization possible. George E. McNeill. The wage system. By 1870, 5 million of the country's 13 million laborers were wage workers, and by the turn of the century, this number had reached 8.6 million, two-thirds of all workers working for wages. This time in the United States also was known for the huge stream of immigrants, many from Europe. Between 1860 and 1890, 10 million immigrants entered the United States. In 1910, 53% of laborers, especially wage workers, were foreign-born. Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, describes wage workers of the time period. Quote, "Here was a population, low-class and mostly foreign, dependent on the whims of men every bit as brutal as old-time slave drivers." End quote. Many of these immigrants lived in or near big cities and mill towns as the South continued to struggle back to its feet after the Civil War and the abolishment of slavery. New South. Although slavery had been abolished, racism and segregation remained throughout the South. Places like Pelzer Mill, owned by Captain Ellison Adger Smith, employed exclusively white laborers. In 1867, for example, 1,400 white women went on a strike when their employer proposed the hiring of 2 black women. For the most part, African Americans worked as low-skilled jobs and as house workers. In a 1937 interview as part of the Federal Writers Project, Charity Anderson reflected on her time as a houseworker. Quote, "Missy, peoples don't live now, and Negroes ain't got no manners and don't know nothing about waiting on white peoples." End quote. Significantly poorer than the North, the South's per capita wealth was 27% of the North's, and even white women earned much less than $300 a year, which was the current poverty line. Southern labor and Piedmont. As industrialization continued and factory mills became more common, as did towns surrounding the mills, called mill villages. Although these villages still housed many living below the poverty line, they were often better options than the rural life as the Southern agricultural crisis deepened. These villages were especially appealing to immigrants who had come to America to escape agricultural deficits in their own countries. Closely monitored by a superintendent employed by the mill company, inhabitants complained about the lack of privacy and maintenance of their homes. Streets were rarely paved, and schools taught in exclusively English. The image shown is that of a classic mill town. It consisted of the mill, many churches, a school, and single-family homes.
At the end of the 19th century, the idea of free schooling, at least for white children, began to grow as leaders realized that the welfare of society now depended on an educated population. By the 20th century, most children between the ages of 3 and 7 were regularly attending one of the 4,000 recently opened schools. This boom of attendance to primary and secondary schools appeared almost entirely in urban and industrial areas, thus that only 4% of all American teenagers were enrolled, and of that 4%, the majority of students were girls. As attendance and enrollment grew for children and teens, education at the collegiate level also expanded. Many agricultural colleges moved to becoming technical institutes, and in 1862, the Federal Land Grant Act began funding state colleges and universities. The act was used to teach agriculture and mechanics without eliminating the other studies offered. Private colleges such as Yale and Harvard were able to grow through generous donations from business leaders, and by 1900, at least 63 Catholic colleges served immigrant children from South and East Europe, as well as Ireland. This burst of expansion benefited women who had little access to higher education before. In 1865, many women's colleges were being founded, and by the 20th century, 125 colleges for women offered courses comparable to those given at colleges like Princeton and Yale. Many women, however, chose to enroll in vocational courses, later becoming part of the national school system, and in 1873, the first school for nursing opened in Boston. For immigrants and working-class citizens, many businesses began offering training for immigrant boys, and both elementary and high schools in Chicago during 1895 offered classes for working-class boys, intended to prepare them for industry or business jobs. While this boom of education greatly benefited middle and working-class Americans and immigrants, African Americans were unable to attend any college that was attended by white students. This caused some all-black colleges to open, and some of these colleges offered rigorous liberal arts courses, while others specialized in vocational training. After college, and despite the huge growth of women in undergraduate studies, many professions were still considered off-limits to women. This caused many women to join unions, helping to build labor and aggregation movements. During this period, women campaigned for their own rights as well, and famous suffrage leader Elizabeth Stanton once said that government based on caste and class privilege cannot stand. The women who were part of the Knights of Labor frequently endorsed the group's political planks while still putting forth their own demands. 16 of these women attended a convention and argued for a department whose sole purpose was to investigate abuses suffered by women in the workplace. Women also had an impact on agricultural and farmers' organizations, such that the patrons of husbandry refused to give out charters unless women who were well represented. Women even made up 1/4 of all members of the Farmers' Alliance. The most well-known women's labor union by far, however, was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The WTCU members fought to make the whole world home-like and even advocated for total abstinence from consuming alcohol. The WTCU also worked to reform the prison system, get rid of the current wage system, and eliminate prostitution. WTCU President Frances Willard even went so far as to draw up plans for a new government system.
To work to support their families in their extra time. But the wages were completely different. On average, in a garment factory with typical 60-hour work week, men were paid $16 while women were paid $6 to $7. In Uptown Sinclair's The Jungle, one of the characters, Marja, is looking for a job, and she gets one with a smaller pay. Quote, she had the muscles of a man, and so he discharged a man and put Marja to do his work, paying her a little more than half than what he was paying before. In 1909, strikers demanded better wages, union recognition, and safer sanitary working conditions from two very large New York factories. The companies hired thugs and prostitutes to beat the strikers, and many were arrested and beaten by the police as well. 2 years later, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire occurred, where this fire spread over 3 floors in half an hour and killed 146 people because there was no fire escape. After this, the working conditions were making some progress. Birth control in the early 20th century was scarce, and many people died from giving birth to so many children, as in Margaret Sanger's mother, who had 11. Margaret Sanger was a strong advocate for birth control, and in 1913 was one of the first persons to give information about contraceptions and devices. In 1912, she wrote articles on female sexuality in local newspapers, and soon she traveled to Europe to learn more about contraception. When she came back, she created a magazine called The Rebel, which provided information on birth control. She faced 45 years of prison after this, so she fled back to Europe. When she came back in 1916, she opened up a clinic and got arrested for it again, and was jailed this time. As you can see from the image, her stance for birth control was supported and was a must-know piece of information. A few years later, clinics opened up in every major city and large town. Two very different men led the African American communities into society and development. Booker T. Washington, a former slave, was an educated man who founded the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. It was devoted to industrial and moral education. Washington was a leading voice man who spoke so awesomely that the whites would stand behind him and follow everything he said. With the help of Andrew Carnegie, he founded the National Business League to inspire black communities to get involved in business. W.E.B. Du Bois had a different approach. A product of middle class, he graduated from Harvard and was the first black man to get a Ph.D. He believed that the problem was the color line, where the races were separated. Quote, the main thing is the you beneath the clothes and skin, the ability to do, the will to conquer, and the determination to understand and know this great, wonderful, curious world. End quote. What he meant is that if you work hard enough, you can also be successful. He believed everyone should be equal, or rather that the blacks were superior than the whites because they worked harder.